All right, let's get started with J.K. Rowling, baby. Here's what happened. In the aftermath of Brianna Gay's hate crime murder that happened in the UK, Turf Island, there were a bunch of former and current New York Times writers and a bunch of activists that got together and wrote a letter to the New York Times with hopes that the New York Times would respond positively to not offering insane support to transphobes for no particular reason other than just like spreading transphobia. And this, of course, created the feedback loop that I guess everyone was expecting, where the New York Times, instead of like listening to these reasonable asks, demands, turned around and doubled down and, of course, wrote some insane shit defending J.K. Rowling, which is not very surprising. Friend of the show, Noah Colwin. This is, by the way, an opinion piece by Pamela Paul, which was prominently featured on the New York Times, in defense of J.K. Rowling. Noah Colwin says, people are dying. Mass homelessness in modern America is a phenomenon that developed in Pamela Paul's lifetime. There are some people who her age live in countries where they've never known peace. I know too many people with 150K master's degrees in journalism who work at the Times and seem comfortable keeping quiet. I wish I knew fewer. Like, J.K. Rowling has a moat in her castle that she lives in. You know what I mean? I'm sure you don't need to defend her. But hold on. Let's look at the New York Times demands from trans people real quick. It's GLAAD that did it, right? We've had enough. We've joined over 100 organizations and leaders to demand that New York Times stop printing inaccurate and harmful misinformation about transgender people and issues. Today, we're outside of the Times building to send a clear message. And the message was, dear New York Times, stop questioning trans people's right to exist and access to medical care, especially at a time when, you know, there's not even that much support for this concept of like blocking trans health care. And yet, for some reason, people are still advocating for it. We talked about this extensively on Transgender Marxist, aka Juniper's stream. We were raising money for trans charities. Friend of the show, Catherine Kruger, wrote an article, Shame on the New York Times. This basically summarizes everything that happened. On Wednesday, nearly 200 contributors to the New York Times made a simple argument to the paper's leadership that its breathless coverage of transgender children and trans healthcare is biased. What other conclusion can you draw, given the relentless string of Times stories raising supposedly troubling concerns about trans people, or the staggering statistic calculated by populist Tom Stocka that the paper has run some 15,000 words worth of front-page stories asking whether care and support for young trans people might be going too far or too fast. Rather than engage with the letter, though, the New York Times instead chose to patronize and dismiss its critics. To make matters worse, it then published an even more transphobic content just 24 hours after the letter dropped. It all adds to a disgraceful display of institutional arrogance. The New York Times doing exactly what like rich, out-of-touch, white liberal feminists love to do, which is find another fucking marginalized group of people to absolutely shit on for no reason whatsoever. Every time the New York Times writes an article like this, the state legislators that pass legislation that no one is even asking for, by the way, to like make it so that it's illegal to give HRT to consenting adults, they use those articles as proof that there are demands. Do you understand? The New York Times finally published a supportive opinion piece on trans people, and the headline was quietly changed to remove the reference about trans people. This is exactly why 100 of current and former writers signed a letter blasting his coverage of trans people. The relentless attack on trans people is an attack on all of us, is what Jamel Bowie wrote on the New York Times. Friend of the show, Jamel Bowie. They quietly changed it to there is no dignity in this kind of America, because it was like a pro-trans op-ed, just very openly doing shit like this. The New York Times has always had like weird right-wing takes. They always have been a center-right staple with some leftist writing on it every now and then, because the New York Times is a part of the mainstream media. And the mainstream media has one goal and one goal only. It's not to like cover objective truth or anything like that. It is to defend capital interests. And obviously, as a part of that, divisive rhetoric that consistently continues to marginalize an otherwise hyper-marginalized group of individuals who have no way to protect themselves, especially with a sea of anti-trans legislation being cut at state legislatures in the least democratic way possible right now, is a good opportunity to keep ramping up the culture war from the center by taking this like objective, neutral stance on whether or not this medical process should be given to trans people. Neutrality in the face of injustice is siding with the oppressor. And they don't even take a neutral position. They take a fucking middle of the ground, like straight fucking in the middle, or sometimes objectively anti-trans take. It's insane that we live in this world where the supposedly liberal mainstream media is just like making an argument about whether or not some populations in this country deserve to get health care or not. Like, that's wild. But of course, the New York Times will turn around and say this is an attack on our coverage. This is an attack on like objectivity in news, in media, when like the piece itself, or at least the pieces I saw of it, correctly identified the issues. In the past year, page A1 of the New York Times has frequently featured stories with one similar theme: whether care and support for young trans people might be going too far or too fast. In the words of Tom Skokoka, writing recently in Popular. By his estimate, the front page stories have totaled more than 15,000 words combined, not counting coverage of similar topics in the op-ed section in New York Times Magazine. He added, page A1 is where questions go. Is the number of young trans people suddenly unusually large? Is it good for young trans people to be getting medical treatment as drastic as breast removal surgery? If they're deferring more drastic medical treatment by taking puberty blockers, is it harmful for them to take those puberty blockers? If they're not getting medical treatment at all, are their schools letting them socially transition too easily? So I am going to instead defend this from, I'm not going to defend this from the perspective of trans people, because a lot of people are transphobic, including liberals. So instead, I'm going to show you how this level of objective coverage, supposedly objective coverage, can still be center-right by giving you a very similar argument that revolves around restricting a minor or an adult's access to a certain kind of medical care. They're doing the just asking questions, just curious attitude to basically hand wave away all the transphobic sentiment by hyping up what the right is also doing, but in way more aggressive and open terms. Imagine if the New York Times was cutting articles like, are the number of young women that are getting abortions suddenly unusually large? Is it good for young women to be getting medical treatment as drastic as late-term abortions? If they're deferring more drastic medical treatment like late-term abortions by taking birth control, is it harmful for them to take birth control? If they're not getting medical treatment at all, are their schools letting them think it's okay to get some level of protection that thinks taking birth control is correct? Because birth control, contraceptives, and also abortions are medical procedures that the right identifies as a threat. They identify that exactly as a threat, and they openly state, when you go to a right-wing outlet, you make no mistake, they say abortion is murder. Even some of them say contraceptives are also unimaginable and shouldn't be taken. You know, they try to stop you. The New York Times, on the other hand, has a liberal attitude towards this, where you will not see them write articles this much because a lot of white women, one, get abortions, and two, are pro-abortion, okay, even if they're fucking conservative. So the New York Times knows its base of support, so they would never fucking concern troll around abortion in this exact same way. But transphobia is easy to concern troll around. It's easy because a lot of people's starting position is transphobic. You have an older, wealthier, out-of-touch base of support in the New York Times. They also don't fucking fully get it, so they're also easy to dupe into being more aggressive, taking a more combative and aggressive stance. The reason why I made this argument and changed it to abortion is because most people hear this and go, wait, these are valuable questions to ask. Yeah, you can make that exact same argument about how valuable those questions are to ask about abortion too. Ultimately, both are medical procedures that the New York Times is advocating to stop at a time when legislation is being written to stop it. On Wednesday, in two separate open letters to the Times leadership, two different groups argued that the Times coverage of transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people is biased. The timing was coordinated, the organization said. The Times has in recent years treated gender diversity with an eerily familiar mix of pseudoscience and euphemistic charged language, while publishing reporting on trans children that omits relevant information about its sources, reads the open letter, organized by the Freelance Solidarity Project, digital media division of the National Writers Union. The letter is addressed to Philip B. Corbett, the Times Associate Managing Editor for Standards, initially signed by more than 200 Times contributors, including Allison Roman, John Herman, Gia Tolanido, the Virginia Soul Smith. Then the letter has gained thousands more signatures since Wednesday morning. The letter notes that the Times coverage has been used to support anti-trans bills across the country. This is Alejandra Caraballo. She mentions this regularly, where she talks about how people use these kinds of screeds that the New York Times publishes when they're making an argument. It's state legislatures. Would they still do it without the New York Times' support? Certainly. I'm sure they would, because they're fucking demons. But why is it that the New York Times, which is supposedly this like liberal institution that cares about truth, justice, and objective news coverage, covering this from an angle that is otherwise lending credence and legitimacy to unfair, anti-scientific, right-wing, anti-trans arguments. Think about that. Last year, Arkansas Attorney General filed an amicus brief in defense of Alabama's Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act, which would make it a felony punishable by up to 10 years imprisonment for any medical provider to administer certain gender-affirming medical care to a minor. Doctors are not allowed to give minors puberty blockers that diverges from their sex assigned at birth. Of course, you can't make an all-encompassing bill because then doctors would not be allowed to prescribe birth control medication. So they had to say that diverges from their sex assigned at birth. So that's the other part of this process, is that, of course, children get fucking medical procedure. And it would be unimaginable if the government sort of decided all of a sudden that children can't get medical procedures. But of course it's okay when it's trans people that we're talking about, because no one wants to defend trans people. The brief cited 3 laws, 3 different New York Times articles to justify support of the law. Emily Bazelon's The Battle Over Gender Therapy, Azine Goraishi's Doctors Debate Whether Trans Teens Need Therapy Before Hormones, and Ross Douthat's How to Make Sense of the New LGBTQ Culture War. As recently as February 8, 2023, attorney David Begley's invited testimony to the Nebraska State Legislature in support of a similar bill, approvingly cited the Times reporting and relied on its reputation as the paper of record to justify criminalizing gender-affirming care. You are playing a role, whether you recognize it or not, in justifying the state interrupting a medical process that the healthcare professional and the patient have decided to go down, to take. That is unimaginable. You will never in a million years consider that to be valid in any capacity if it was for any other ailment, any other treatment. That is bananas. Part of it is also this like belittling of trans existence and making it seem like it's a purely cosmetic thing. It's like, it's the same as like allowing someone to get breast implants, like allowing a 16-year-old girl, a cisgender girl, to get breast implants when it's not. It's no different than minors getting birth control. It's no different than minors getting any other kind of hormones for whatever kind of hormone imbalance that they have going on. But under no circumstance would that be appropriate. Trans healthcare saves lives. Trans acceptance saves lives. And the worst part about it is that these people know, a lot of the people in the New York Times know that that's the case, and yet they still do it. They do not care if trans people kill themselves. They don't care. That's the sad state of affairs. The letter draws parallels between the Times coverage of trans people and earlier decades its coverage of gay people and the HIV/AIDS and its treatment of gay employees. The New York Times managing director, executive editor A.M. Rosenthal neglected to put AIDS on the front page until 1983, by which time the virus had already killed 500 New Yorkers, they write. He withheld planned promotions from colleagues he learned on the grapevine were gay. Many of his employees feared being outed. That last link is to a 2018 piece in the Times T magazine, 6 Times journalists on paper's history covering AIDS and gay issues. Reading the Times' early HIV/AIDS coverage, T magazine editor-at-large Kurt Suller wrote then, is to be reminded how news coverage shapes perceptions and policies, particularly when it comes to oppressed communities. In an interview with Hellgate, New York, Joe Livingstone, a critic and writer who helped organize the Freelance Solidarities Project's letter, argued that the Times reporting on trans people is intended in part to drive views and outrage. There are really not many trans people in America. That's the part that is like deeply frustrating to me. Trans people are such a tiny fraction of society, and yet they make up so much of the culture war coverage. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. Half the time when people were writing legislation about like not allowing trans girls to participate in high school sports or whatever, they were writing that to like bully or stop like a random trans girl that's like 12 or 14 years old from participating at the fucking swim meets. And that's it. One person. You're writing a whole ass legislation to like bully one person who isn't even that good at swimming. There's nothing. Like, you've just never met a trans person if you think that, like, all trans people are, like, fucking demon athletes, you know? But because it's a question that seems to relate to institutions that people feel ownership over, for example, schools, especially primary schools, you know, what are people doing with my child when I'm not around? I think there's that paranoia at the heart of what makes people want to read about this stuff, which is only getting more and more intense the more the coverage. Newspapers have a passive explanation. What people want to read is the news that we report. And just to go back to what I was saying before, that is a willful misreading of what journalism does in society. I think they're doing it because, yes, there is this like weird, creepy fascination because these are, albeit a small group of people, but a group of people that completely shake the foundation of gender, which is so important to everyone's identity as a consequence of the social conditioning revolving around the rigid binary. So you see someone who is trans and you go, what the fuck? I don't understand this at all. Please tell me this is wrong. Please tell me this is morally abhorrent. And that's it. These people are hurting no one. They just want to exist. The fact that people care so much is weird. Trans people don't care as much about trans issues as transphobes do. It's crazy. GLAAD also published an open letter on Wednesday in protests outside Times headquarters calling out the Times' irresponsible, biased coverage of transgender people. That letter was signed by more than 100 equality and media organizations, individuals including celebrities like Judd Apatow and Margaret Cho. GLAAD's letter includes specific demands for the Times, including a meeting with trans community members and more hiring of trans employees. The Freelance Solidarity Project's letter simply asks for a response. And a response they got. Charlie Statlander of the New York Times, their director of external communications, provided a statement on Wednesday afternoon saying, "We received the open letter delivered by GLAAD and welcome their feedback. We understand how GLAAD and the co-signers of the letter see our coverage, but at the same time, we recognize that GLAAD's advocacy mission and the Times' journalistic mission are different." Yeah, we know. GLAAD is like trying to prevent trans people from being fucking murdered, trans people from being legislated away out of existence. And the New York Times is like, no, actually, it's good that we're doing that and we should do more of it. So yeah, that's the difference. I love that this, by the way, is exactly what right-wing news outlets would say. Sorry, we are going to care about freedom of speech. You're taking down our free speech, which they're not. No one is. We're going to keep writing about how trans people shouldn't get fucking medical coverage. Sorry, that's our journalistic mission. Nice, man. Thank you. As a news organization, we pursue independent reporting on transgender issues that include profiling groundbreakers in the movement, challenges and prejudices faced by the community, and how society is grappling with debates about care. By the way, this attitude is precisely the reason why the New York Times has always been on the wrong side of history. This is why you can go back to the Bracero program with the New York Times defending the program, literally with the words wetback on their fucking headline. This is precisely why you can go back far enough and find op-eds defending Adolf Hitler. That's why they're always on the wrong side of history, because they're not there to write objectively. This is why you don't even have to go back that far to see what their opinion is on the Iraq War. I mean, here. New homosexual disorder worries health officials. That was when they mentioned AIDS, by the way. Before that, they just refused to cover it. In 1986, the New York Times ran a William F. Buckley op-ed in which argued that the government should force people with AIDS to get 2 tattoos advertising their status, one on their forearm and another on the ass. William F. Buckley is a fascist right-wing psychopath. Here's the New York Times writing a puff piece on Hitler. Her Hitler at home in the clouds, high up on his favorite mountain. He finds time for politics, solitude, and frequent official parties. Her Hitler in the clouds. Mussolini, hope of youth, Italy's man of tomorrow. Hitler, driving force in Germany's fascism. His fiery orator has won men of all classes to support the doctrine of National Bolshevism. Spectacular rise to power. He has energy and reserve. Germany's Duce. I mean, he was. Now, of course, if you ask me, as the New York Times, I'm not like fucking delusional, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you, is the New York Times still like an advocate for Nazis? Not at the time, not anymore, because it's not fashionable to do so, because we are in the post-World War II existence. But I promise you, if you think that they would cover Nazis with the same level of like scathing criticism, I don't know, let's say 10 years down the line, let's say something crazy happens and like Nazis have risen to power, fascism is taking over everywhere around the world. If you think that they would be critical of that sort of thing, you are delusional. Their job is never to criticize power structures. Their job is to defend pre-existing power structures. Days after hundreds of current and former New York Times writers pleaded with the New York Times to stop their transphobic coverage, and days after a 16-year-old trans girl in the UK was murdered in a hate crime, they published this bullshit. They don't care. The cruelty is the point, says Alejandra. And she's right. This is the same writer who's a damn straight white woman trying to police a black queer woman on what words to use to describe their identity, the goddamn caucasity. She says, let's say gay. The very news stories criticized in their letter reported deeply and empathetically on issues of care and well-being for trans teens and adults, is what the New York Times said. Our journalism strives to explore, interrogate, and reflect the experiences, ideas, and debates in society to help readers understand them. Our reporting did exactly that, and we're proud of it. Here's why that's a lie. You can cover both sides of an argument, as the New York Times often does, sometimes to a degree that really frustrates me. Like when they heavily feature actual fucking lobbyists that get paid to promote anti-abortion screeds. They do this all the time. They do this with that too. However, when they do that, at least they know to massage the narrative in a way that favors abortion, in a way that recognizes that abortion is a medical procedure that needs to be kept between a woman and her medical professional. They don't do the fucking both sides hand-washing, hand-wavy bullshit because rich white liberals care about abortion. They get abortions. But they might be, as a consequence of how little the trans community is, how small it is, they might not have anyone in proximity. They might not have a trans person that they care about. And they can't see anything in front of their fucking noses. That's it. I asked Statlander to clarify which letters this statement is referring to, just the GLAAD one or the other one from the Times contributors. He responded, the letter you linked to with the numerous signatories was delivered in person by GLAAD reps to the New York Times this morning. GLAAD issued press releases and letters of their own simultaneously, but the open letter you're talking about came through us through GLAAD. The statement applies to both. On Thursday, the group of Times writers behind the letter told me GLAAD confirmed to us that they did not deliver a copy of our letter to the New York Times. We look forward to the clarification in the Times. You can read the Times contribution letter here or sign it here. Here are facts that the Times chooses not to include in favor of fringe anti-trans voices who are not experts on medical care for trans youth. Every major medical association supports gender-affirming care as best practices care that is safe and life-saving and has widespread consensus in the medical and scientific communities. This is a fact that often goes overlooked. When you hear someone talking about trans people as though, or trans care, gender-affirming care as a bad thing with negative consequences, that should be your telltale sign that you're not talking to a serious person. The same could be said about vaccines. The New York Times did not allow a single fucking peep about vaccines. The New York Times covered vaccines objectively and fairly and truthfully. No one fucking turned around and said, wow, I can't believe you're not taking every fucking chiropractor who decides that vaccines make you gay and autistic seriously. Why is it that it's different for HRT? Why is it that it's different for puberty blockers? Why is that the case when the medical community has the exact same consensus on this as they do on vaccines? Very interesting. Much to ponder about. Weird. Because when you engage in transphobia, that is beneficial to capital owners because it is a harmless, marginalized group that has no way of defending itself, and you can ride the culture war narrative. Present yourself as like the objective truth tellers. But when you go against vaccines, which were a culture war issue, you are directly hurting the profit centers. Vaccines became a major culture war issue. Why the fuck did the New York Times not cover it in that way? You want to know why? Because anyone that doesn't get vaccinated can't return to fucking work safely. A lot of people, myself included, promoted vaccines because we understood that it helps you be more safe in the era of COVID. But business owners wanted everybody to get vaccinated because they wanted a workforce that wouldn't have to, take 2 weeks off or even have potential long-term consequences of COVID. So the New York Times was never going to allow any kind of dissent on vaccine information. You get it? In November, the Times published a story that got the science of gender-affirming care so wrong that the WPATH had to write a multi-page teardown explaining how the Times misrepresented the facts at every turn. This is the outcome of this. But no one reads the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Like, no one cares. So the demands were stop printing biased anti-trans stories, stop the anti-trans narratives immediately, stop platforming anti-trans activists, stop presenting anti-trans extremists as average Americans without an agenda, stop questioning trans people's right to exist and access medical care, stop questioning best practice medical care, stop questioning science that is settled. Valid. In a normal world, in a normal planet, in a normal universe, if the Times was like, the arbiter of objective, truthful coverage, this would not be an ask. This would just be by design. There's an update from the NewYorkLetter.com. We are disappointed that the New York Times chose to use their public response to Wednesday's coalition letter from GLAAD and other organizations as an opportunity to attempt to dismiss the well-documented complaint of editorial bias detailed in our letter. Times representatives avoided addressing the substantive concerns in the letter by simply alleging that it came to them through GLAAD. However, GLAAD confirmed to us that they did not deliver the copy of our letter. Additionally, though, we coordinated timing with GLAAD. Our letters are very different documents. For example, we are not an advocacy organization. Our letter is addressed directly to the standards editor and makes a clear case drawing on the Times' own history and editorial standards. Here is the memo from Joe Kahn, the New York Times staff, responding to yesterday's letter regarding trans coverage. By the way, Times leadership says the paper will not tolerate participation by Times journalists in protests organized by advocacy groups or attacks on colleagues on social media and other public forums. It is not unusual for outside groups to critique our coverage or to rally supporters to seek to influence our journalism. In this case, however, members of our staff and contributors to the Times joined in the effort. Their protest letter included direct attacks on several of our colleagues, singling them out by name. You should just not suck ass then. Have you tried tried having colleagues that aren't fucking gigantic monstrous pieces of shit. I'm just saying. That's a good way, I think, to make sure this doesn't happen. Participation in such a campaign is against the letter and spirit of our ethics policy. Yeah. Covering transphobic screeds from psychotic, delusional anti-trans extremists is also a part of our ethics policy, but demanding a change to said policy that actually literally fucking violates the ethics policy that they supposedly have, that in and of itself, that doesn't violate the ethics policy. Yeah, here. This probably, for the New York Times, which will celebrate this, by the way, this should be a perfect demonstration that you have fucked up. And I said this to the fucking people who were up my asshole when they were yelling about the Hogwarts legacy shit. Ben Shapiro agrees with you and used the same terminology that you used. Same as the New York Times. Ben Shapiro agrees with you, New York Times. Remember that.
Not one scientific fact appears in this open letter. Not one. There's not a study that is cited. There's not data that is cited. Nothing. It's just a foregone conclusion that their perspective is fact, and what the New York Times is promoting, which, by the way, is steeped in science, is actually not even worthy of the debate. All of us dare say are—
That's not true. That's not true. That's not true. No, they want the New York Times to cover it objectively, rooting the science at the center of the conversation. This is not up for discussion. It is no different than the fucking vaccine debate. God damn it, dude. Yeah, by the way, this is an internal memo where in the internal memo they said, oh, you wrote this letter, like some of you wrote this letter and we're going to punish you. But to the public, they were like, oh, GLAAD is an advocacy organization. We will not capitulate to like advocates, which in and of itself is weird. But remember that the internal memo definitely fucking acknowledged that it was New York Times contributors that fucking wrote it and signed it, former and current New York Times contributors. It's helpful to their cause to conflate both letters as one letter from an advocacy group rather than acknowledging that the letter they're actually talking about here was written and signed by current and former New York Times contributors. Remember that. Their internal memo reflects that reality. Externally, however, they're like, oh, you're an advocacy group. Shut the fuck up.
legal action against the New York Times. So I feel a conflict. One, the New York Times, its reporting on this has been shockingly decent. Two, the New York Times deserves every iota of this. It deserves every iota. You guys decided to feed, pet, ride, join with the alligator. You were the teeth in the culture, the cancel culture alligator, and now the alligator is eating you. And you guys have it coming. Yeah, have it coming. I'm sorry to break it to you.
God, I saw people in quote retweets and replies saying white people didn't belong in black movies. It made me so sad. Why? Why do you care? This is what I mean. Don't be fucking a fragile little baby either. Yeah, who cares? You are not advocating for black lives because you want black people to be nice to you. You're advocating for black lives because you care about black lives as black people are people too. Every group, every marginalized identity has collectively chirped at me on Twitter. I have not changed my opinion on the matter because I don't give a fuck if they don't like me. And you shouldn't either. Your values should be unshakable. Last year, I received an email from Megan Phelps Roper, a strange daughter of Westboro Baptist Church. She asked if I'd give an interview on the podcast on J.K. Rowling, the world's foremost champion of backlash to trans rights. I agreed. This was a serious lapse in judgment. Here's what I was thinking at the time. Megan is a famous reformed bigot. She used to picket funerals holding a God hates F-word sign. She told me she had personally interviewed J.K. Rowling and it confronted her with talking points from my video. She spoke in the J.K. Rowling about me and thought it seemed only right to speak to me about J.K. Rowling. This is what was pitched to me. I took the bait and consented to a pretty miserable 3-hour interrogation about my own transition as well as the usual concerns about trans rights. At the end of the interview, Megan asked if I had any advice about the project. I said that the one thing she definitely should not do is frame the conflict as a debate between two equally legitimate sides, trans people versus transphobes. Both have some good points, which is of course what I assume happened, which is what it always whittles down to, even though that is not the case. That is not the reality. It's now clear that this is exactly what she's done, how she's conceptualized the project from the outset. Her stance seems to be that trans people and transphobes are equally dogmatic and combative, that if we could all just have a calm, civil conversation, empathy would prevail. It's about distorting effects of fear and of the internet. Search Twitter for trans witch hunt, and you'll find no shortage of people, both Team Trans and Team TERF, who see themselves as the object of a moral panic. This is what is really frustrating about the media cycle nowadays. For me in particular, this literally is exactly what I was talking about. This conversation is larger than just trans people. It is about how the social media endless cycle of outrage, that outrage loop, feeds into false narratives. This is not the case. In the real world, the unfortunate reality is that most people are just apathetic about trans people. They don't give a fuck. They don't care. They don't have a really strong opinion on trans people one way or another. They just don't. And that's the reality. But on the internet, everyone does. So if you're constantly on the fucking internet, you just develop this false understanding. She thinks this way because of her experience leaving the WBC, aided by people on Twitter who kindly push back against her former hateful views. From this, she's extrapolated an entire political worldview. The basic problem facing humanity is too much polarization, incivility. The aggrieved gays, the mourning families of dead soldiers screaming back at her. You don't de-radicalize a bigot that way. Instead, the argument goes, we should approach bigots with love and compassion. There's truth here about the rhetoric, but it has been disastrously misapplied. The fundamental problem is that Megan only understands bigotry from the bigot's point of view. Her experience with the Westboro Baptist Church has given her a heightened capacity to sympathize with bigots and a diminished capacity to reckon with harm done by bigotry's victims. I love this take. This is very true. I think this is a thing that you see with people who are de-radicalized, and there are plenty of them in this community as well. This is something you need to constantly check yourself on. And some of you have checked yourself on this. You've actually literally mentioned this in the past in the chat. I feel like I am succumbing to my prior opinions, my reactionary perspective sometimes when I hear you talk about certain issues and the reaction to certain issues. It triggers this like response within me. It's something that you need to squash and destroy. Because that's why I always talk about this from every side of the perspective. When trans people are yelling at you, that should not get you to change your opinions about trans people and go back to being transphobic. Because you're not being nice to trans people. You're advocating for the humanity of trans people, not because you want trans people to be nice to you in return, but because you believe that that is the just thing to do. It's the right thing to do because you hate bullies. You hate injustice. That is what is supposed to be your guiding principle. This empty centrism cannot conceive of systemic power of the legislative, institutional, and stochastic terror threats wielded against LGBT people. In assessing the trans debate, it has no standard but civility by which to judge the merits of both sides, which is, again, liberal posturing. It's lib bullshit. You're focusing on the civility of a conversation that's happening online in like hyper-specific circles because that's all you hear when there isn't like pro-trans legislation that actually impacts cis people in a negative way. That's not even a thing. That's not even a concept. There is no like, if I see a cis person with a, with a trans child, that means like that cis person is going to jail because they're grooming them or something like that. That's not a real thing. But the inverse of that is true. So understand that there is no narrative that's like trying to write cis people out of existence. It's a completely made up thing. And the only real tangible legislative agenda is expressly anti-trans. Megan does not seem to grasp that trans people are fighting for our lives, our right to exist in society, and this fight is in no way equivalent to the rationalizations offered by people who oppose trans rights, even when the former are angry and the latter composed. Yes, she thinks God hates F words is wrong because it's rude, but if God merely has a few reasonable concerns about F words, well then we'd better do a whole podcast exploring the intricate nuances of her point of view. I love that. That's something that I always talk about. Like, a lot of edgelords think that, like, the N-word, for example, is just a mean word and that black people are simply offended because it's a hurtful and mean word. But there's a reason why it holds so much power. And it has nothing to do with, how it makes black people feel. That's secondary. The power doesn't come from the power that you give it as black individuals. The power comes from the systemic injustices that it's associated with. It's backed, as Oni Spumoni correctly points out, by institutional power. It's ongoing contemporary examples of what that word means. It's disparities that you see in every facet of your existence. It is yet another somber reminder. That's why it's a powerful word, not because it hurts black people's feelings, which is why whenever some fucking dumbass tries to make the argument that like Karen or cracker is a slur of a similar magnitude, 98% of people, not the 2% that are on Reddit, laugh you out of the fucking room. That's why I can say one word and not the other one. Because there is no institutional harm that the words are associated with. That's why when you look at the etymology of certain words, most of them, as it pertains to white people, impact white people on a classist disposition, like hillbilly, redneck. These are all not just white people. This doesn't encompass all white people, but very specific types of white people. Or sometimes cracker objectively gives power to the white person. The etymology of that word comes from cracking the whip, a whip cracker.